My name's David Goodhart. I'm head of the demography unit at Policy Exchange, and we're talking this afternoon about social mobility, a subject that lends itself to dreary consensus, platitude and hand-wringing, but we're going to try and avoid that fate today. I think there are two worries about social mobility that have emerged in the last decade or so. One is that it's declined since the high point of the 60s and the 70s, when we saw huge new numbers of professional jobs particularly being created. The truth is we don't know this for certain. Social mobility is incredibly difficult to measure, and indeed there are many different ways of measuring it, but there is a general consensus that we have a little bit less of it, at least, than we used to. And one of the reasons for that is because of the expansion of higher education in the middle class and upper middle class, domination of higher education, along with the degree requirement, the growing degree requirement for so many decent jobs. And this has created a kind of hereditary meritocracy, which is a problem. And there has been work done on, by one of the people on this panel, about how that can be broken, the so-called opportunity gap. It's harder to work your way up sort of from the shop floor to the boardroom than it was a generation or two ago. I think the other thing that we worry about now, again related to the expansion of higher education, is the potentially damaging impact of that huge expansion on the remaining, 50-60% of people who don't go into higher education. There's a kind of darker shadow cast back on you than in the days when perhaps only 10 or 15% of people in your class went on to higher education. You went to work in one of the local offices or factories. There was no shame in that. But when half of your colleagues, half of your schoolmates go to university and you don't, then there is a potential damage to your status and indeed so many jobs that you may go into have the lower status of non-graduate employment has so much lower status than it used to. Now we have. Clearly, governments have been worrying about that, and we've seen, the development of the apprenticeship levy in recent times. We've seen the development of T-levels. Obviously, they haven't happened yet, and I think that is the kind of other side of the coin. What are we going to do about the other 50%? And Paul Collier, who's just written a book called, with the unambitious title of "The Future of Capitalism," talked about how the misranking of esteem between cognitive and non-cognitive training. He also makes the incredibly good, obvious but sort of good point that I'd never really thought of before, which is that it's easier in some ways to go from school, which is after all a cognitive environment, to university, which is another cognitive environment, than it is to go from school cognitive environment to the non-cognitive environment of work. And yet we massively, even with tuition fees, we massively subsidise higher education more than we do adult training or other forms of post-school education. Anyway, that's enough from me. We've got lots of people on the panel and not very much time, so I'm going to be quite brutal in restricting people to about 5 minutes. And who we've actually got here, to my immediate right, you'll recognise Damian Hinds, Secretary of State for Education. To Damian's right is Melanie Richards, who's Deputy Chair of KPMG, who are sponsoring this event, by the way. Thank you very much for that. And to Melanie's right is my colleague at Policy Exchange, Joanna Williams. To my left is Julie Nugent, who is the local voice, Director of Productivity and Skills at the West Midlands Combined Authority. And to Julie's left is Andy Ratcliffe, who is the Chief Executive of Impetus-PEF. What does the PEF stand for?
Private Equity Foundation.
Private Equity Foundation. I'm going to ask Melanie to go first, if she doesn't mind.
I don't mind at all. Can everyone hear me okay? I thought I'd start by giving sort of a personal perspective, and I believe, and fortunately for me, so does my organisation, regardless, and I'm trying not to get too hand-wringing here, David, of where you come from or who you are, everyone should have an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. Now, that's easy to say, but in my experience has been much more difficult to achieve. The playing field's definitively not level, and something we must all not only acknowledge but accept. One of the reasons we at KPMG are working towards what we call a fairer future for the people who we attract to our firm and society at large is that the lifeblood of our business is people. That's what we offer out, and our country's future prosperity is bound up in it. We hire more than 1,000 graduates, but we also hire more than 200 apprentices every year. And we're working really hard now to give people from a really broad variety of backgrounds the opportunity not just to join us, but to succeed and thrive in our organisation. But for me, this isn't just about our recruitment. It's about impacting the communities we work in and working with people, supporting them as individuals to improve their skills and employability, to ensure that they have much greater aspiration, opportunity and choice even before they leave school. So our outreach does focus on some more traditional things like literacy and numeracy, but it also focused on some of the things David was flagging, which was developing a culture of lifelong learning, which is so critical now to organisations like ours, which are fast-moving and an ever-changing landscape that we're living in. Helping people to be curious and willing to learn new skills is critical now and into the future. Poor literacy and numeracy is costing the country 50 billion. And of course, it impacts those greatest from those from a low socioeconomic background. But I don't believe it's for government alone to solve and tackle these complex issues. I believe business can and should play a part, which is why we work to bring together and collaborate with other businesses, charities and government to create greater impact. One example would be our role in National Numeracy Day, we saw with the charity National Numeracy, we got 25,000 people registered onto a free online service in just 1 month to improve their numeracy skills. But of course, this isn't just about one day. As with many of the things that we do, it's about bringing people and organisations together to create sustainable and impactful change. And our people love to get involved and to play a part in driving social mobility. In the last year alone, 3,000 people in our organisation volunteered across 22 offices right across the country, contributing 40,000 hours, supporting 17,000 people, preparing those people for the world of work and sometimes happily attracting them to our organisation. Now, we're going to continue to build on our progress and we'll be redoubling our efforts to create a fairer firm. But we will also be focusing on more collaboration, playing our part in developing the aspiration and curiosity of young people across our country.
Thank you. Andy, thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to Policy Exchange for having me, and to KPMG for sponsoring the event. At Impetus, we exist to give disadvantaged young people the same chance to succeed in school and work as their better off classmates, and we do that by finding great high potential charities, working with those young people and backing them for the long term to do that better and to work with more young people. So the topic of social mobility is right up our street. I think I might have been at conference too long, because when I was thinking about this event, I started thinking about Social Mobility, the movie, and I asked for some advice from the Twitterati on what that film might be called, and leading contenders at the moment are Charlie and the Great Glass Ceiling, the Where You're Born Conspiracy.
Oh, I like it.
Sorry. Okay, I'll stop there. But I do think we have an image in our head of what the film of social mobility looks like. It looks something like a working class kid being the first in their family to go to university, and that university probably has some very nice old buildings. It looks like a working class kid doing a very, very high quality apprenticeship, probably with a hard hat, probably in a very well-known company. That's a great film, and it's the film we all want to watch. But what I want to talk about is the prequel and the sequel. So the reason we don't see that film very often is because of what happens before. So the prequel to that social mobility success story is getting the basics right. It's getting maths and English GCSE, and so much of the policy that we hear talked about for social mobility is irrelevant for the majority of disadvantaged young people because they will leave school without those basic qualifications. So a third of young people across the board leave school without maths and English GCSE, and that's 2/3 for disadvantaged young people. The government has a policy that we should resit them, so young people should have a second chance if they fail the first time. If you're from a disadvantaged background, your chances of passing maths GCSE on the resit is 8%. So I really welcome the growth in apprenticeships. I really welcome the introduction of T-levels. I think the Secretary of State's reinvestment in support for resits is all right. But we've got to realise that most apprenticeships aren't available to most disadvantaged young people because they haven't got the entry requirements. T-levels won't be available to most disadvantaged young people because they haven't got the entry requirements. University will not be available for most disadvantaged young people. So all the policy innovation is right, but until we fix the basics, it's irrelevant. So we need to get the prequel right, and I think a big part of that, and one of the things I've been really pleased about in the debate in the run-up to conference is that we need to start talking about colleges, not just schools. And I think the underinvestment in further education from successive governments is one of the root causes of why so many young people are getting to 18 without those basic qualifications. So that's the prequel. The sequel is that even if we crack education, it's probably only half the battle of social mobility. We, with the support of KPMG, are just doing some analysis on the youth jobs gap, looking at how opportunities for disadvantaged young people vary across the country. And one of the things we're finding is that even if you leave school with the same qualifications, if you're from a disadvantaged family, you're still much, much more likely to be out of work and education at 18. If you go to university, the same subject, and get the same class of degree, but you're from a disadvantaged background, you're still going to earn less. I've got a very critical...
Usually they save this for the ministers.
So education on its own isn't going to be enough. And that's why I think Melanie's points are so important. That's where the employer comes in. That's where pay and paying the living wage, as KPMG are committed to do, and progression becomes so important. So I'd love education to be the rocket fuel. It's probably only half the battle. So
directions. So I use these terms very, very loosely, but it seems as if from the political right, we are wanting to rehabilitate a narrative of genetic determinism. More and more, we seem to be arguing that people are a product of their genes, which to me kind of worryingly suggests that your life circumstances are pretty much decided at the moment of conception, and you're playing out a destiny that comes from your brain synapses, if you're into neuroscience, or comes from your genetics, if you're that way inclined. I was going to name names, but I will avoid naming names at that point. From the left, on the other hand, we have a kind of counter-narrative which doesn't so much buy into the idea that people are victims of their genetics or destined to play out a genetic destiny, but are victims of their life circumstances, that the circumstances you find yourself in, from your family background, from your postcode, whether you were on free school meals or not, whether your parents were divorced or have stayed together, all of these circumstances decide the course of your life. But from both of those narratives, you really get the idea that there's very little that individuals can do, very little that we can do ourselves to actually change the course of our destiny. And so I think it's so important that we're talking about social mobility this afternoon, because to me it really raises a challenge to that creeping fatalism that says that the course of your life is predetermined and there's nothing you can do to change it. However, I have one slight concern about the social mobility discussion as the way it's so often framed. And my concern is that sometimes I think it's easy to fall into the trap of conceiving of social mobility as medicine, in effect, that we can kind of dole out to people, that we can do, for all very, very well-intentioned reasons, that we can somehow do social mobility to people. And I think that's a mistake. I think what we're forgetting in this sometimes is the role of individuals themselves in being able to bring about their own social mobility. And I'm not going to sit here for 1 second and pretend that that's a really easy thing to do. But I think when it comes to education, when it comes to social policy, what we need to be thinking about is really how we can remove obstacles that at the moment get in the way of people being able to exercise social mobility. And I think most importantly of all in relation to education, how we can provide opportunities for people, because even education, which at heart for me, maybe this sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but the most important part of education is learning. It's what the students, what the young people actually learn as they go through education. And learning, again, is something that you can't do for someone. You can provide the opportunities, you can inspire, hopefully, good teachers are doing this every single day. You can put exciting content and material before people, but you can't actually learn for them. You have to remove barriers, you have to create opportunities for them to be able to take control and learn themselves. My final point, which comes from this idea that social mobility is perhaps a medicine that can be doled out, and can be doled out particularly through the education system. I guess another thing that keeps me awake at night, the final thing that I'm going to admit to worrying about in relation to this discussion, is that we end up focusing education around social mobility, and we create a two-tier education system where middle-class children get education for the sake of education. They get knowledge because it's exciting, inspiring, interesting, and just the stuff of what we need to know about the world and our place in the world. And working-class kids get education for social mobility. And to me, that would be tragic, because I think working-class children deserve education for the sake of it every bit as much as middle-class children. So, and just to end with a final anecdote, I've spent before I arrived at Policy Exchange, I've spent most of the past decade working in higher education, and one of the things we've been very preoccupied with in higher education is about widening participation, which I guess is another kind of way into the social mobility discussion. How can we get more people into universities? And one particular anecdote that sticks in my head, this was a couple of years ago. I went to a conference, we were discussing widening participation, and somebody said the very, very sensible point that I completely agree with, that if we're interested in widening participation, we're leaving it too late to just talk to students when they're 16, 17. We need to start much younger than that. So I completely agreed with that. But the speaker then followed it up by saying, so we need to go into primary schools, we need to talk to 10 and 11-year-olds, we need to talk to them about pensions. We need to talk to them about the graduate premium. We need to tell them how much more money they will earn if they go to university than if they don't go to university. And I just thought, this is so depressing. If you are really going to go and talk to 10-year-olds about their pension, you know, if you can't stand in front of a class full of 10-year-olds and sell, and I use that word advisedly, university on the basis that it's going to be the most exciting, inspiring, intellectual and knowledge-based journey, whether you're doing a vocational course or a purely academic course, the most exciting intellectual experience of your life, an opportunity to spend 3 years engrossed in the subject that you are most interested in, working alongside other people who are also completely fascinated and experts in that area, you know, wow. Because if you can't do that, they are certainly not going to be inspired at the age of 10 by talk about pension contributions and lifetime earning differentials.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm feeling like a little bit of a fraud at the moment because I'm not going to talk about policies particularly. I think what we're trying to do here in the West Midlands through the auspices of the Combined Authority, working with our mayor, is a very much more practical and pragmatic approach where we have a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. So bluntly, we have, for the first time ever, unprecedented levels of investment going on in the West Midlands, record numbers of jobs being created, huge opportunity for our people, for our older workers as well. But at the same time, we know that too many people are still being left behind, and that's young people. We have a really stubborn, persistent figure of youth unemployment, which hasn't changed, despite the fact that employment overall is increasing and unemployment is coming down. We have too many of our communities who don't work, who've never worked, who don't see work as anything for them. And we've got to do something about it if the growth that we want, if the communities we want to build are better, happier, more productive. At the same time, we work with businesses a lot. They have skill shortages that they need to be addressed. The labour market is tightening for reasons we all understand. So we've got a real challenge, but a real opportunity. So for us, social mobility is kind of at the heart of what we're doing practically. For me personally, skills is the main driver of social mobility. It's giving people the right skills, the right aptitudes, the right opportunities and connections to get good jobs, to get great jobs, actually, great careers. And how we're doing that, in many ways, is getting on with it. We're delighted earlier today with Esther McVeigh. We announced a trial of progression coaches. So basically what that is, a very practical example, what more we need to do with our young unemployed people to connect them into the many thousands of apprenticeship and job vacancies that are out there at the moment. And a bit as my colleague said, in theory, this shouldn't be happening. There are opportunities there. But in practice, there are just gaps, things that aren't quite happening in the system. So whether that's an individual responsibility or a systemic failure, I kind of don't care. I kind of want to say, what is it we need to be doing a little bit smarter, a little bit better to connect more of those young people into jobs. And actually, if somebody needs to be supported to resit their maths GCSE, because otherwise they'll never be able to get into a good apprenticeship, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't our colleges and training providers doing that? You know, have we asked them to do it? So getting those links right between job centres, between our FE providers. If it's a case of they haven't got the transport fare, well, again, you know, we're a transport authority. Can we not do something about that? So really looking for tangible ways of just getting the system to work smarter. We think lots of the building blocks are already there. We think in the West Midlands particularly, there are opportunities, there are jobs to go for. There's an economic imperative, there's a social imperative. And part of the opportunity we think devolution brings is just that ability to grease the system, to make those bits come together. So actually we realise the social kind of mobility agenda, but also the economic one too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Thanks very much indeed, David. So I've just been in the hall saying that we think it is self-evident that every generation should have greater opportunities than the last. I also think we all in this room think it is self-evident that every young person should have the opportunity to reach their individual potential. It's sort of self-evident from a social justice point of view, but there's another reason as well. So economists talk about equity and efficiency and how sometimes there is a tension between those two things. The beauty about social mobility is it achieves both at the same time. Because actually, if you're going to have a fully productive economy and society capable of doing all the things it's capable of, then actually you have to use the talents of everybody, as well as being right for the fulfillment and self-actualization of those people. this is the most enormous subject you could possibly have picked for a for a short fringe event, and there are many, many things I'd like to say, but I'm not going to stray well, maybe a tiny bit, but not massively over my 5 minutes. But just let me say a couple of general things about the subject. A few years ago, I used to chair the all-party parliamentary group on social mobility, and we decided that we needed to come together to create the dreary consensus that David is worried about. The things we could agree about what were the challenges for British social mobility. And we came up with a document called 7 Key Truths about social mobility. And actually, education is the rocket fuel, as it says in the title of this session. But it's also true that the work of KPMG and others, the work of widening participation in higher education, the provision of basic skills, all of these things are part of social mobility, alongside what happens purely at school. And quite often when different people are talking about social mobility to somebody else, they think they're talking about the same thing, but it turns out they're not, because there are so many different strands. And in particular, in that cross-party group, we identified 3 quite different things. The first we called breaking out, which is for children with particularly difficult backgrounds, particularly challenging circumstances, being able to get into the mainstream and have a chance alongside everybody else. Then, if you like, at the other end of the spectrum was what we call stars to shine. That if you are a particularly talented individual, in whatever way that might be, musically, sporting, or academic, or whatever, that you should have a chance alongside the kids who've been to the very best schools and all the rest of it. And then there's the 80% of kids in the middle. They should just be able to move up a little bit, get into a walk of life where they can provide well for their families and do a little bit better than their mums and dads. All of those things are social mobility, but they do have some different policy prescriptions for them. We have seen quite some successes in the last few years. And I want to praise Impetus Private Equity, alongside the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, which you support, and others who have done such good work in making sure we pursue evidence-based policies, enabled often by the pupil premium and differential approaches that can be taken with different groups of kids. I'm also going to talk about the English Baccalaureate, which doesn't often come up in this context, but actually the EBAC, that set of core subjects that we encourage kids to take, is a set of enabling subjects that will keep children's options most open. And most people in this room, your parents told you to do those subjects. For those kids who don't necessarily have that same background, the EBAC and then facilitating subjects at A level it's an important signal to then be able to get into, for example, a top third university. And overall, in the last since 2010, we've seen the attainment gap between the rich and the poor narrow at every phase, from nursery school to primary school to secondary school to university entry, and that is all very, very encouraging. But of course, there's masses left to do. And we talk about the narrowing the gap. That's a narrowing the gap by at least 10% in each of those phases. 10% still leaves quite a lot, and we know we need to do a great deal more. Opportunity areas are a big focus for us at the moment, taking 12 particular areas in the country on quite a small geographic basis. They may be, some of them even within regions or sub-regions, which are actually quite affluent, but little pockets of social immobility, and try to have a really sort of concentrated approach at what you can do to improve things there. We've had huge success in this country over 15, 20 years in London schools in particular, and a challenge for public policy has to be to see what you can learn from what has happened in London and spread elsewhere. And anybody who tells you they know why London has done so well is a fibber, because it is much more complicated than saying, there was one particular public policy programme or one particular thing that happened. But we need to try and do what we can to understand it. Multi-academy trusts are also a way that we spread good practice, and we can spread initiatives on mobility. And overall, as also I've just been saying in the hall, we need to make sure that as we continue to focus on academic standards and don't let up at all in that area, and we owe that to all children, also we make sure that we rebalance the focus with technical and vocational education, which, I mean, for decades, I mean, since any of us really have been alive, hasn't had as much focus in this country as the academic route. I know I'm slightly over time, but can I just suggest a couple of things which I think are open questions for public policy in this area, and we might touch on some of these in discussion.
You get a special
One is,
state allowance.
oh, do I? Oh, that's very nice. Usually it seems to work the other way often. But, so one of them is about place. And there's been a groundbreaking study in the United States by an academic called Ratcliffe, who looked at the effect of growing up in different cities and indeed different suburbs in different parts of the US and what that did to your social mobility, even if you hold constant for class, and discovered some very interesting things. Now, we want to try and replicate as far as we can that kind of study in the UK and see what more we can learn. I've already touched on London exceptionalism, and we need to see what it is possible to derive from what's happened in London, bearing in mind that you can't always just copy something from one area to another and expect it to work in the same way. I've also just been talking in the hall about character and resilience. And, we need to really make sure we're giving enough emphasis in this, not only to the qualifications that kids get, but also to the development of everything else. And I think, drive, determination, resilience, all these things are important alongside, of course, networks and access to the things that can raise aspiration. And finally, my final open question is about home. So any study that you ever read about social mobility, sooner or later gets back to the point that you have to go earlier and earlier and earlier in a child's life. And eventually you get to the point of, ages 0 to 3. And however much, funded nursery care there is available and so on, actually most of that time is spent at home. Public policy, it's very difficult to go into, the home environment for obvious reasons and good reasons. But we need to think about how public policy can best support families to do what they want to do and make sure that all kids get off to as good a start as they can. Those are my opening remarks, right. David. Thank you very much for indulging me on the time. But I look forward to the questions.
Yeah. Let me just ask you a couple of questions myself, if you don't mind. I mean, one thing that I think is a particular issue in this country is that social mobility is so connected to geographic mobility, as you were implying. I mean, there are whole zones of the country where people don't move. And I mean, that's partly because we have such a high proportion of people going to residential universities. I mean, if university is, for most people, the gateway or part of the gateway to upward mobility, then they are kind of by definition taken from their sort of places of origin, where they went to school, where their kind of family and networks of friends are, and they join another network. But there are quite a few people who don't want to move. That implies somehow, if we could wave a magic wand, it would imply kind of spreading high status jobs more equally around the country. But obviously, life doesn't really work like that. So that's one point. What do we do about that? Often rather sort of depressing connection that you have to be mobile. You have to leave in order to succeed from so many parts that, unless you come from certain parts of London or Manchester already. The other thing is the whole kind of trade-off, as I mentioned at the beginning, between the high floor that Andy was talking about, getting the basic education right. I mean, Christopher Lasch, the American social critic, he counterposes the idea of the general competence of society against the idea of focusing so much on sifting out the brightest, the ladders out, the council estate to cabinet, sort of Alan Milburn stories, because actually that is a story of dramatically distinguishing between winners and losers. I mean, this is the Michael Young critique of meritocracy. That obviously you want meritocratic selection in the most important jobs, but you don't actually want to be a meritocratic society. A meritocratic society is an awful place that ruthlessly divides winners from losers and makes very large proportions of society. After all, half the population are by definition in the bottom half of the cognitive ability spectrum. How are those people supposed to feel about themselves? That we have to balance that against the obvious desire to get the brightest people from whatever background, and perhaps particularly from less privileged backgrounds, into the kind of golden triangle of professional life.
Gosh, can I have another 8 minutes? There's quite a lot there, I think, to respond to. So look, geographical mobility and social mobility clearly are linked. But the different rates of social mobility in different parts of the country, that is a different thing. I mean, again, they are connected with each other, but they're separate issues to address. Of course, in this country, we have relatively low numbers of people staying at home, being based in the parental home to go to university. You see that a lot more in a lot of other countries. So that is itself
Including
actually...
America, actually. About half of college students stay at home.
Yes. So that is itself a factor in promoting geographic mobility. Actually, you know, for really good social mobility in an area, you need two-way mobility. So you need both people leaving and people coming in. I mean, because that's what happens. If you think about, you know, what happens in the home counties or in London, or, you know, you name your affluent part of the country, you get that. You get movement the whole time. And it is very important that you can, you know, if you have young people coming into, say, study in higher education in one particular region of the country, that there's also opportunities for them to stay there to work. And you said, you know, you can't have a utopian world where you say, well, we must spread the jobs out more evenly. Actually, of course, you can, because it's up to companies to decide where they settle. And there's a real incentive to say, you know, we know that there is talent spread throughout the country. Let's go where we can nab some of that. It's a competitive advantage. And you know, don't underestimate the effect of things like the BBC in Salford. I mean, that is a huge
spreading the institutions out of London.
A huge impact. Maybe we'll talk about the meritocracy stuff later.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else up here want to briefly come back to the Secretary of State before we go out to the audience? Yeah.
Just very quickly, I think one thing that we haven't really done so far in this debate is to actually define what we mean by social mobility. I think we just take it for granted that we all know what that means. But I mean, I would want to ask, what exactly are we getting at here when we're talking about social mobility? Does it mean to have a professional job, whatever the salary is? I mean, is it a professional job? Is it having a lifestyle that's better than your parents? Is it moving from the working class to becoming middle class? Is it having an income above a certain level? Because I think how we define social mobility is crucial then to who we are saying is demonstrating social mobility or not. I think the other important question that we haven't touched upon yet is whether, I mean, we're assuming upward social mobility, but does upward social mobility for some necessarily require downward social mobility for others? Because if we're assuming a fixed number of professional jobs that we can redistribute around the country, then that would be the logical consequence of following that definition.
I think the definition of social mobility is moving from Middlesbrough to Canterbury, as Joanna has done in her life.
I think that's geographical mobility, though, to be fair. Pro-social mobility.
Anyway, let's go out to gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Joe Rich. I was Conservative candidate in Stoke-on-Trent South in 2015. In the real world, I'm a barrister. I'm not going to win any prizes with this, but taking Andy's quest for a pun on a film, I would advocate the magnificent 7 years. And I'd like to ask the panel, adopting the rocket analogy, where do you put the fuel? Do you put it in the first stage, the second stage, or the third stage? Because what I would say is that I read with great happiness what Damian had to say back at the end of July about the early years and the sadness of people arriving at nursery school unable to talk, not just unable to read, but unable to talk. And you were attacked by The Guardian, who said, you know, it'll take more than an app to solve this. But any step that we can take to make sure that people can arrive in some sort of educational establishment able to talk is going to be a very good thing. And if you concentrate your spend on those first 7 years, surely people are going to be in a position where they can not just be helped, but help themselves. At a higher level, amongst my friends, there are people who've chosen to focus their spend on their children's education at an early stage.
Okay.
Would the panel do so?
Right. Gentleman there. Try and spread it around a bit.
Aidan Rell from the Association of Employment and Learning Providers. Andy referred to the GCSE resits policy, and Julie also referred to it acting as a GCSEs not passing acting as a barrier to getting an apprenticeship. Given the appalling pass rates that Andy referred to, and the fact that we do have the availability of applied functional skills now, why does the government persist with the GCSE resits policy?
Perhaps one more. Guy right at the back.
Rod Bristow from the education company Pearson. I do sort of empathise with the Secretary of State's point that this actually includes pretty much everything to do with education, so it's a huge subject. But I just want to pick up on one thing that was said, a very interesting statistic about the number of students studying in higher education at home in other countries versus the UK. In fact, we are seeing growth in the number of students that want to study at home in the UK in higher education too. And it is associated perhaps with social mobility, that the kinds of learners from the kinds of social backgrounds that want to go to university are perhaps more confident studying within their own communities, near their own homes. And actually a powerful force for social mobility is taking education to those communities, high quality education, higher education, and the role that technology can play in doing that. The role of technology in reaching out and helping take high quality career focused education from the best universities to people in their communities.
Let's get some responses. You don't have to answer all of the questions, but any that you want to answer. We'll just go down the line. Yep.
Yeah, just to pick up the point about when. Obviously, I'm attracted to the person who came up with the pun. When you should intervene. If you look at the gap between young people from disadvantaged families and the rest, it grows a lot 0 to 5, so before primary school. It's actually reasonably flat in primary school. It goes out a little bit, and then it goes out a lot again in secondary, roughly the same amount as it goes out. Well, firstly, we're getting something right in primary, which is interesting, and we should think about what that is. It definitely suggests that high quality early intervention before school is important and has got a big role to play. I worked on parenting policy as an advisor to Gordon Brown, and I absolutely sympathise with the Secretary of State's framing of that question, because we've always known the home learning environment was hugely important for education attainment, and we've always had very good reasons not to interfere with it. It was the biggest frustration in education policy. I think it still is in some ways. So we definitely need to find a way to be helpful there. And for me, the opportunity there was always that parents want help. And I think we've often struggled with the home learning environment stuff, that we thought it was for parents that were failing. But actually, I think most parents find it pretty scary and want help. And I think it's a very simple point in a way, but I think that's the opportunity if we can grasp it. I would also say, though, that intervening in secondary school can work. There's very different drivers then. The evidence in the United States suggests that high quality tutoring, even quite late in high school, can have quite a big effect on educational attainment, and as good and as big an effect as some of the best quality early years interventions. So we support a couple of tutoring charities that give free tutoring to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, because we think 16, 14 is not too late. So I think we learn from primary, and we hit the beginning and the end of the school career, I suppose.
Do you want a quick one?
Just very quickly, and I don't think it's an either or. I think you have to do both in terms of intervention. But one of the opportunities, and working with some of Damian's colleagues in DFE, is looking at adults in work with low or no skills, giving them training, giving them access to better jobs, better careers, because they'll take that back into their families, into their communities, and it has that multiplier effect that is so important to us. And just another quick point: we're talking a lot about university, but actually apprenticeships offer, I think, a different route to give people those skills as well. And for many people in communities that want to stay at home but still want to get a degree, still want to have a really great job, apprenticeships are the route, and actually increasingly first choice.
You know, do you
So I was going to pick up on this point that Andy was making, and I would hate to think that there's ever a point at which it's too late to intervene. The way in which we sort of started to debate it, I'm not an educationalist, as you may have gathered on this panel, but I do think in terms of what I see having an impact, and I talked about the number of people we have going into schools, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact on particularly secondary school students on seeing what's available and what's out there that they don't get to see normally in their daily lives necessarily. And I think we've built great aspiration in young people, and that aspiration drives their desire to learn, and that drives their desire to get educated. And I couldn't agree more that there's been quite a lot of focus on higher education and getting people into higher education for obvious reasons on the panel, but it's not the only route. And I do think that that's where I do think business needs to come in, because how do people know what they should be aspiring to if they haven't been exposed to it? And that's big business, but also small business as well. And I think finding those routes and connectivities is absolutely critical.
quick, well, let's go to the Secretary of State and then...
Okay, thank you. So first of all, to Rod from Pearson, I mean, yes, absolutely. I think ed tech, so technology and education, can play a really important role. It's still at a relatively early stage of development. We have to see how these things can be furthered. I mean, to deepen learning, to do new things like help parents in the home, and also in schools, actually, you know, to help with workload and so on. So I think there's a big opportunity there. It kind of links with the question from Joe from Stoke, but of course it is more than just an app. So the technology plays a role, but you know, let's not overestimate it. But just because these things are hard to do and they require a multiple approach doesn't mean we should give up. And of course we have done quite a lot already in the early years. I mean, particularly with the 15 hours of free childcare for disadvantaged 2-year-olds. I mean, that is a really, really important programme. And finally, to Andy from AELP, your question was, why do we persist with asking young people to do GCSEs again? I mean, the answer is because there is such a massive premium on having GCSE English and maths in the workplace, you know, as reflected in things like the Wolf Report. Now, there is also, as you rightly say, there's the facility for functional maths and all the rest of it. We need young people to be doing as well at these things as they can. And I was really struck. I was in Germany 2 weeks ago, looking at their vocational system, which, you know, is widely regarded as one of the best in the world. Firstly, I mean, the great bulk of children in that country are doing what we would call the English baccalaureate up until age 16, or actually in many cases age 18. And even then, when they start their 2-year or 3.5-year apprenticeship, they are still doing English and maths in their 1.5 days a week at college, reflecting the importance. And German, in case one thinks that was a mistake. They are doing English as well as German and maths because it has such importance in the workplace today.
Interesting.
Okay. David's looking daggers at me and telling me I've got just 30 seconds, so I'm going to leave the where to focus in case I get a chance to come back to that next. But a very, very quick point on the GCSE results. I fully, GCSE resits, I agree with you on this, Damian. I fully support the idea that students should have to retake GCSEs if they don't pass them the first time in key subjects like English and maths. I would temper slightly the alarm, understandable alarm at the 8% statistic, because I think we need to take into account the fact that over the past few years we've actually got a new syllabus, a new curriculum in maths. It has become, and I think for all kinds of good reasons, it's become more challenging. So in a way it would be understandable that fewer students would be passing it next time round. I do think there is a problem if all we expect young people to do is to repeat what didn't work for them the first time round. I mean, that's just ludicrous. So what we need to do is give people another opportunity to take the exam, but we need to actually think about doing something different, whether that's a different approach to pedagogy, teaching them within a different environment, thinking how can we make sure that we get it right this time round, rather than just repeating the mistakes that we've made once already.
Okay, I'll take a final round, and then we'll come back for final comments from the panel. Lady at the front here.
To me, social mobility is being given the opportunity to reach wherever your abilities will take you. If you can do that, you've gone as far as you can go, and that's great. It implies a ladder, and I feel that one of the rungs of the ladder was removed with the removal of grammar schools. Grammar schools aren't the complete answer, but as an ex-grammar school pupil, I still am in contact with a lot of people I was at school with. And what I see is a group of people that are self-assured, they have self-confidence. And when I was at school, none of us were aware of the other social backgrounds, whether the person's father was somebody who swept the streets or was a senior executive. We just didn't know. And even now, I'm completely unaware of the backgrounds of the people I was at school with.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there.
Tom Brown, I'm from Newark.
Say where you're from.
I'm from Newark in Nottinghamshire, but I'm very much involved in a multi-academy with its head office in Birmingham, in the Jewellery Centre. So that's why I don't take my wife with me when I go to meetings. And I'm very much involved in FE, further education, and so I'd like your views on that. And one of the things which has just come up, and this may be a help on that, we spend a lot of time in early years teaching our children, spending a lot of time on the things they're not very good at. And we don't spend too much time on what they are good at. I mean, it's about evolution. If Mother Duck taught its ducklings how to walk instead of flying, it would soon be cat food. So I'm saying this is another way of actually looking things. So I'd like your views on further education.
All right, lady right at the back there, standing up.
Tamara Ray from the Devizes constituency. I should also say that I'm a trustee of a early years childcare setting, many parents, all parents, are obviously very grateful for the additional childcare funding for working parents. But many businesses, Damian, as you probably know, are not so happy. The funding rate doesn't go at anywhere near the actual business costs. And as you probably heard, Jeremy Corbyn did say in his speech that many settings across the country are closing. Is that true? And is the market sustainable to provide the places that we need for our young children?
Silver-haired guy there in the glasses.
Thank you very much. Martin Prendergast from the National Theatre. Thinking about the Culture Secretary's announcement yesterday about youth performance partnerships, I wondered whether the Secretary of State and the panel had a view on the role of access to the arts in education and how that plays into social mobility.
Okay, just a couple more guys standing at the back. Not everyone's going to be able to get in, I'm afraid.
Just great to hear the Secretary of State's commitment to character and resilience back in education. We've had it before, but it's great to hear it back on the agenda. So what I would say is actually we need more than just here today, gone tomorrow plans. What's the big game changer? We've been trying to do this for over 20 years. We've got a full-time social action review, which tells you to create an NCS gold offer, pilot that for the country, that could last for 25 years like it has in the US. So what the plans are really ambitious plans is going to change the game with character and resilience.
All right, a guy in glasses there, and then really quickly, we might get in you two.
Rory Stewart said yesterday 42% of prisoners, of the 85,000 prisoners, were excluded from school. And exclusions are going up, and obviously this is highly relevant to this. How do we handle that going forward?
Okay, the lady, and then...
Sarah Foxall from Microsoft. I was struck by Andy's comments about the prequel period and Joanna's comments about obstacles. I'm interested in views on what those obstacles are that are preventing success during the school phase and what, if any, policy responses there can be. I'm not convinced they're always in school.
Okay, final one. Sorry, everyone else, but...
William Salomon, Young Enterprise. Looking at education and the need for non-academic activities within the school place, we look after about 250,000 kids within the school system at some point or other. But the biggest problem is because there's no ring-fenced funding for non-academic progress, how do we make sure that the sort of can be enterprise, but could be other subjects, that enable people to develop the skills that people need in work, cooperation, working together, presentation, taking ownership of problems, can adequately be presented in the school environment.
Okay, thanks very much. Final word from everybody up here, and then we've got our competition at the end, our film title competition.
So I will definitely not try and respond to everything. That's definitely the Secretary of State's job. The one thing I wanted to come back to actually was the point Joe made right at the beginning about fatalism. That I do think in a lot of ways people think it would be nice if poor kids did well at school, but they sort of don't think it's really possible. There's a bit of like the poor have always been with us. I think people won't say it that way, but I think people don't really think we can really change this. And I don't really believe that for a couple of reasons. One, I think when you see schools improve in the same area, serving the same community, they can be absolutely transformed, and the chances of the young people living in those communities can be absolutely transformed. I went to a school in Telford where 16% got 5A Starter C when I went, and it got made an academy and supported by a well-run local school, and now it's about 75%, and it's the same kinds of young people, and that is a meaningful change. And then the other thing, I always think it's quite useful to talk about the actual numbers of young people. You talk about rates, but say you wanted to halve the gap in GCSEs, it's a very crude measure, but say you wanted to halve the gap in GCSEs between disadvantaged young people and the rest. How many more disadvantaged kids have to pass to halve the gap? 20,000, right? That's six per secondary school. And they're not evenly distributed, so it's a bit more complicated than that, but on average 6 per secondary school. And if we think that's beyond the wit of man, then we might as well pack up, eh?
So with a man, with a woman, either. I think the point about ex-offenders is kind of crucial to what we're doing, because we believe that there's both the social aspect of that, making sure we're realising that potential. But again, there's an economic imperative. So across the region, we have thousands of jobs that need filling. We have ex-offenders, we have refugees, we have young unemployed. But actually, if we give them the skills and the opportunity, we think there's a real economic case to make to get those people, giving them the skills and allowing them to have better jobs, better careers, create better communities for their families as well to grow up in.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I wanted to pick up on, just take this, I just wanted to pick up on this whole area of non-academic activity in schools and the need to build character and resilience. And I said at the top of this that I didn't think or feel that this is something that government can do alone, or indeed the education system can do alone. And I think that is where you need to pull and harness more business, the business community, because I know I speak for many, that there are very many willing people, organisations who want to help with that intervention, but need a route through to do that.
Thanks.
I think it's a really great question about what do I consider to be the obstacles standing in the way of social mobility. So thank you for asking that one. At risk of sounding very wishy-washy, I think the main obstacle, as far as I'm concerned, is endemic low expectations. And what goes along with that is a tyranny of relevance, where some children are labelled as being less likely to succeed. Therefore, we should lower our expectations in advance. So we decide that you're not cut out for Shakespeare, therefore, when I'm just using that, plucking it at random, you're not cut out for algebra, so we're going to limit you to basic literacy and basic numeracy. And I think this ties into two other things that I'll just comment on very briefly. Access to arts. I agree with you. I think every child should have access to the arts. And I think this was what I was trying to express at the beginning. If we shape education too much exclusively around social social mobility, then we run the risk of saying arts is irrelevant and music is not something which is necessarily going to get you onto the next rung of the career ladder, therefore let's abandon it. And I think that would be tragic. So to touch very quickly then upon the grammar school point, I'm a huge hypocrite when it comes to speaking about grammar schools because my own 3 children go to grammar schools, so I'm really conscious of that. But at heart, I actually think that every parent I've ever met wants their child to go to a school that's got high standards and offers their children a knowledge-based, rigorous and academic curriculum. And I think skills are obviously very important, but the best skills have a rigorous academic component to them too. And I think if you look at so I live in Canterbury, I've already been outed for that one. If you look at the mania that sweeps through parents of 8, 9, 10-year-old children, and you ask, well, what lies behind that mania to get their children across the threshold to pass the 11+? It is this fact that they want them to go to a school that's going to have high expectations, high standards, a rigorous knowledge-based approach.
Thank you. Secretary of State.
Very good. So I'm going to try and touch briefly on all the different subjects that came up. Forgive me if I don't quite manage to do so in as much detail as I might like. But starting with the early years, yes, we have extended the entitlement to early years programmes, and in working out what's the right level to remunerate nurseries. I mean, that is an exercise that's done analytically. It benchmarks different costs in different nurseries and comes up with an approach. We keep it under control, of course, because we need to make sure that sufficient places are made available. And this year they were. I mean, there were substantially, everybody who was trying to get a place on the programme did manage to do so. But as I say, we do keep it under control. On grammar schools, look, it has been mentioned periodically that I went to one. I can't deny that. I went to a good school. I'm very pleased with the school I went to. But when I talk to people about why they say they want grammar schools and all the rest, and a little bit, actually, you said this as well, and a little bit you said it as well. Actually, all those things about high aspirations and about the sorts of standards that you want to see in schools, actually, they don't need to happen in a grammar school. They can happen in a comprehensive intake school too. So that's what we need to be focusing on, is making that available to everybody. On character development programmes and the arts and so on, there is a lot of this goes on. I mean, the government puts a lot of money into arts and participation at all different levels. And there are also many organisations, including yours, which are involved in it. Similarly on business, actually I was speaking to a load of business leaders yesterday about all the different programmes that different companies, KPMG is another one, that put these programmes on about business awareness and various related subjects in schools. Sometimes I think it's not as easy as it could be for the schools to know about them, because you're all trying to market your own things, and quite rightly. And I think that is something we might be able to do better on, is to sort of put opportunities together, put the customer together with the vendor, if you see what I mean. On FE colleges, look, this is a very important time for how we develop technical and vocational education and training. I've just been talking in the hall about apprenticeships and T-levels. Over this decade, the amount of money that's available for apprenticeships will be doubling, and there's new money that goes behind T-levels to enable more hours of work, more hours of study in colleges, and also facilitate meaningful industrial placements. And finally, I think, on who said exclusions? Just exclusions. This is a really important topic. We have to be a bit careful with the direction of causality when we talk about the criminal justice system and those who've been excluded from school. But there is a correlation. And exclusions have been going up in the last couple of years. They're not back at the peak that they were, by the way, before 2010. But nevertheless, when you see a trend like that, it's a matter of concern. And we do need to both look at which schools and which areas are doing it well, because you do find that different areas and different individual schools, the numbers of kids getting excluded vary quite significantly. And we also need to be concerned about what happens to those who are excluded, that the alternative provision and so on is there in place.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to KPMG. I think we managed to avoid hand-wringing, or too much hand-wringing. Did anyone come up with a good title? Stick your hand up if you did. No. Go on then. Come on. Shout it out. Shout it out.
Study Wars, the workforce awakens.
Study
Oh!
Anyway.
Have we not started a Twitter storm with this question?
Yeah, there was a bit of a Twitter storm.
Any other entries into the competition? No.
Oh.
Well, yeah, no, it's all right. She'll tell you personally. She's not terribly proud of it. Anyway, can we just say thank you to the panel again? Thank you very much.